How are you?
Excellent.
You know, I actually worried a little bit that, very prestigious actor, well thought of actor, well trained actor, and you're backstage with all these animals. Is everything okay?
Yeah, as long as you don't wear vanilla.
Vanilla.
Hollywood has seen countless stars, but few like Timothy Dalton, a man who was right yet at the wrong time. He was the cold, gritty, and most faithful adaptation of James Bond to the original source, yet audiences turned their backs on him. While Daniel Craig was praised for bringing a serious, grounded Bond to the screen, the truth is, Timothy Dalton had done it 2 decades earlier, only to receive a mixed response. Why did a talent like his appear as Bond only twice before vanishing? Why has he never married despite captivating many leading ladies? Behind that suave exterior, was he a lonely man, forever running from the limelight and commitment? Timothy Dalton delivered a Bond truer than ever before, but the audience wasn't ready to embrace him, and perhaps that was their greatest mistake. Timothy Dalton was born on March 21, 1946, in Colwyn Bay, Wales, to a family of mixed English and American heritage. His father was a British intelligence officer, a disciplined and principled man who had served in the Special Operations Executive (SOE) during World War II. His mother was American, which granted Dalton U.S. citizenship by law, though he grew up and spent most of his life in England. Growing up in a household with a father in intelligence, Dalton was not the kind of boy who dreamed of the stage or the bright lights of Hollywood. He wanted to be a strong man like his father, a soldier, a pilot, perhaps even a real-life spy. No one expected young Dalton to become an actor, as he was always inclined toward a life of discipline, precision, and real-world action. As a teenager, Dalton enrolled in an air cadet training program, preparing for a future in the military or aerospace industry. For a long time, he dreamed of becoming an astronaut, taking part in the exploration of space. From the blue skies to journeys beyond the Earth's atmosphere, that was the path Dalton believed he was destined to follow. But fate had other plans. One day, young Dalton stepped into a theater and watched Shakespeare's Macbeth. In that moment, everything changed. The power of the words, the intensity of emotions on stage, and the way an actor could command an entire space with just their voice, it overwhelmed him. He was drawn into the world of Shakespeare, of drama, of stories far greater than himself. In that single moment, his dreams of being a pilot, a soldier, or an intelligence officer completely faded. Dalton knew this was his true path, but also filled with shadows he had yet to discover. After the fateful shock of discovering Shakespeare, Timothy Dalton wasted no time in pursuing his new path. At the age of 18, he was accepted into the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, RADA, one of the most prestigious acting schools in England. But unlike many other students, Dalton had no patience for waiting around. He wanted action, he wanted to perform immediately. Before long, he made the bold decision to leave RADA without completing his course. It could have been a risky move, but for Dalton, it was a calculated step. He joined the National Theatre, where he was immersed in classic plays and honed his acting skills on some of the grandest stages. Dalton quickly proved himself. Shakespearean theatre became the perfect launching pad for the young man with a deep, commanding voice, aristocratic presence, and an piercing gaze. Audiences were captivated and critics swiftly took notice. This was not just a talented actor, but a true star in the making. His performances in Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and Henry IV cemented his status as one of the brightest names on the British stage. And then, as if fate had planned it all along, the doors of cinema opened. And then came the defining opportunity in 1968 when he landed the role of King Philip II of France in The Lion in Winter. The film boasted a stellar cast, including Peter O'Toole, Katharine Hepburn, and Anthony Hopkins, yet Dalton was anything but overshadowed. Timothy Dalton was never a conventional film actor. He was a rebel. He refused safe roles, never chased fame, yet somehow became one of the most striking cinematic figures of the 1970s. After the success of The Lion in Winter, 1968, Dalton officially joined the ranks of Britain's most promising film stars. But to become a legend, an actor must leave a unique mark. And Dalton chose a path unlike any other. Ignoring commercial roles, he focused on films with deep psychological layers portraying complex, conflicted characters, roles that allowed him to fully utilize his piercing gaze and commanding voice. Cromwell, 1970, a historical drama about the English Civil War, where Dalton played Prince Rupert, a nobleman caught in the whirlwind of power struggles. Mary, Queen of Scots, 1971. He transformed into Henry Darnley, the ill-fated husband of Queen Mary. A character who appeared charming on the surface, but harbored ambition and tragedy beneath. Wuthering Heights, 1970. This was a defining moment. Dalton took on the role of Heathcliff, a tormented soul torn between love and vengeance. He didn't just play Heathcliff, he became Heathcliff. And from that point on, audiences realized Timothy Dalton wasn't just another actor, he was a true artist. Yet despite earning a formidable reputation, Dalton still needed a role that was magnetic, mysterious, dangerous, and passionately intense. And then, in 1983, that moment arrived. Timothy Dalton took on the role of Edward Rochester in Jane Eyre, a romantic figure shrouded in darkness. His Rochester was not a typical charming gentleman. He was intense, enigmatic, at times cold, yet filled with longing. And when he spoke, his deep razor-sharp voice commanded every scene, drawing audiences into every word, every glance. The film was not only a success, but cemented Dalton as an eternal romantic icon on screen. In 1986, Timothy Dalton stood on the stage of the Royal Theatre, performing alongside Vanessa Redgrave, a woman he had once loved deeply. This was where he belonged. The world of Shakespeare, where dialogue was a weapon and the stage lights meant everything. But then, a phone call from Eon Productions changed his life forever. They wanted him to become James Bond, one of the most iconic roles in cinematic history, a huge opportunity, an unmissable turning point. Yet for Dalton, it also raised an unsettling question. Was this the greatest trap Hollywood had ever set for him? The truth is, Dalton was no stranger to the name James Bond. He had been approached for the role as far back as 1968, when Sean Connery first stepped away after You Only Live Twice. At the time, producers believed a young talent like Dalton could carry on Connery's legacy, but he declined. The reason? He was only 22 years old. Dalton believed Bond had to be a man of experience. He couldn't be a young boy in a tuxedo, awkwardly holding a Walther PPK. The role eventually went to George Lazenby, and everyone knows how that turned out. A disaster. But the story didn't end there. In 1971, when Connery left for the second time after Diamonds Are Forever, Dalton was once again considered. However, this time, the producers pivoted toward Roger Moore, a completely different kind of Bond. Charming, humorous, and lighthearted. The franchise took a more entertaining, over-the-top direction, turning Bond into a far cry from Ian Fleming's original creation. Once again, Dalton was forgotten. By 1981, Roger Moore was nearing 54 and considering stepping down. Dalton's name resurfaced once more. But Moore decided to stay on for a few more years, filming For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy. Again, Dalton missed his moment. Then, in 1985, A View to a Kill marked Moore's final appearance as Bond. This time, fate no longer delayed. No one saw coming, but Dalton's official announcement that he would be the fourth James Bond in cinematic history would also signal the beginning of the end for his career. Dalton knew from the start that he wouldn't be playing James Bond in the vein of Moore or Connery. Returning the character to Ian Fleming's initial concept was his goal. An icy, broken agent became more of a pawn for the state than a show-stopping hero. Dalton devoted months to studying the Bond character's psychology and researching the source material. His goal was to make Bond seem more like an actual human being, not merely a womanizer who makes jokes while on the run. And it was with that resolve that he debuted a brand new 007 in 1987's The Living Daylights. Critically acclaimed, commercially successful, and with respectable box office returns, the picture was well written. Audiences, however, were unprepared for such a connection. For more than 10 years, they had grown accustomed to a charming and humorous James Bond, capable of killing a man with a single hand while smiling mischievously. It wasn't Dalton who did that. He lacked Roger Moore's flirtatiousness and smirked instead of smiling after action sequences. Audiences felt uneasy because he was a serious, realistic Bond who could be brutal at times. License to Kill, 1989, his second Bond film, was darker, grittier, and more violent than his previous work. Rather than merely completing a mission, Bond's motivation this time was a thirst for revenge. James Bond, a man torn between duty and his own feelings, is a Bond who isn't afraid to kill. Audiences thought the picture deviated too much from the stereotypical James Bond. Unfortunately, a true nightmare befell the Bond franchise shortly thereafter, so Dalton was never given the opportunity to demonstrate his point of view. In 1990, the next Bond film was postponed indefinitely due to a legal dispute between Aeon Productions and MGM, the studio in charge of distribution for the Bond films. At the same time, Dalton was bound to wait because he was still under contract with the studio. Because of his ties to Aeon's upper management, he was unable to take on other significant roles. He remained stuck for almost 5 years, unable to fully embody either Bond or anyone else. Once MGM's legal issues were finally resolved in 1993, they made the decision to relaunch the franchise in a more commercial and mainstream direction. Not for a single film, but for good measure, they wanted Dalton to return. They wanted him to sign a long-term deal that would tie him to several Bond films. For Dalton, this meant serving time in prison. Bond wasn't the part he wanted to keep playing after he'd waited too long and missed too many chances. The official announcement of Timothy Dalton's departure from the role of James Bond was made in 1994. 2 months down the road, Pierce Brosnan was unveiled as the replacement for James Bond. The 1995 smash hit GoldenEye marked the beginning of a brilliant new age for the James Bond film series. With the charisma of Connery and the grace of Moore, Brosnan managed to capture the essence of Dalton's Bond, a hero to audiences who was neither too different from Fleming's original character nor too similar to criticize. As Brosnan reveled in the limelight, Dalton virtually vanished from the Hollywood scene. Dalton later admitted that he had never been a fan of playing Bond for an extended period of time, but that the truth was that he did regret leaving the role. After he left, his career took a nosedive. He went on to appear in a sparse assortment of TV series and independent films in the years that followed. He was never cast in another film of Bond's caliber. 2 decades later, in 2006, Daniel Craig made his debut in Casino Royale, which may have been the biggest irony of all. His Bond was lauded for being more intense, brutal, and realistic than in the past. Audiences now admired Timothy Dalton for the very traits they had previously rejected. Imagine if Dalton hadn't been a dud Bond. Simply put, he was a Bond from another era. Did Hollywood miss out on the ideal James Bond because fans weren't prepared to embrace him just yet? Many of Timothy Dalton's film roles featured aloof, mysterious, and haughty male leads. His real-life romantic feelings were once as intense as his on-screen personas. This was more than a casual love affair. A man who shied away from commitment and a woman who desired a genuine family had a lovely but tragic love story. It did not end happily ever after, as do many passionate but troubled relationships. Dalton first crossed paths with Vanessa Redgrave in 1971 while filming Mary, Queen of Scots. She was a renowned actress in her own right, with a husband and children of her own, while he was a young actor of 25 years old. She was the antithesis of the carefree, youthful women who usually accompanied Hollywood's leading men, an intelligent, powerful, and commanding woman. The age difference and other social obstacles were irrelevant to Dalton. It didn't take long for him to feel an attraction to Vanessa. Not due to her attractiveness or fame, but rather her fearless character. No one he had ever met before was like Vanessa Redgrave. Daring to be challenged, self-reliant, and proud. And Dalton, ever the fearless adventurer, was hell-bent on pursuing her no matter what. They started dating in a way that was completely unconventional. It was Vanessa's. Their love was rapid, intense, passionate, and consumed them completely. They got through the ups and downs of the film industry as a team, performed together, and stood shoulder to shoulder on stage. They never tied the knot, though. That was unimportant at first. They defied convention as two free-spirited artists. However, as time went on, their divergent goals and aspirations for the future became apparent. A real family was what Vanessa desired. She yearned for a long-term commitment by wanting a family with Dalton. Dalton, on the other hand, had no interest in getting married. In his view, love does not last forever. He was not interested in a house that required him to be responsible. He desired affection, but he was unwilling to commit. That, in the end, was the cause of their separation. They were hopelessly stuck in love for more than 10 years. Dalton was an independent man who did things his way, refusing to compromise, not even for the sake of the woman he loved. Dalton, meanwhile, could never provide Vanessa with the certainty she needed. They eventually broke up because their differences were too great to resolve. Unlike many Hollywood breakups, this one was amicable. The couple simply decided they couldn't continue down the same path. Vanessa kept working and creating her own life. As the man who avoided commitment, Dalton retreated to his own world. Then, as fate would have it, Dalton would end up in yet another intense love affair. On this occasion, though, betrayal would accompany the inevitable end of the relationship. Dalton met the stunning young Russian singer and pianist Oksana Grigorieva in 1995, when he was almost 50 years old. He was nearly 20 years older than she was, captivating all who lay eyes upon her with the enigmatic allure of Eastern Europe. Oksana, more importantly, was not Vanessa Redgrave. There was no strong, independent actress who dared to challenge him, she was merely a stage woman. On the contrary, she elevated him to the status of center stage, a strong man capable of shielding a vulnerable woman. And that's the thing that hooked him. Their passionate romance blossomed rapidly. An association that appeared to be diametrically opposed to Dalton's previous romantic involvement. Oksana let him keep control, unlike Vanessa, who made him choose between his independence and the expectations of a strong woman. He had no qualms about committing to love. However, Dalton persisted in declining to take a knee even after all signs of approval were in place. An individual who would never submit to the control of another. Their son's pregnancy did not sway him from his position. Alexander was born to them in 1997. Dalton was a doting father who provided for his child no matter what, even though he never wed Oksana. Even though he claimed Alexander to be his life's greatest joy, that didn't guarantee he'd tie the knot. Dalton thought the formula had infinite potential. Embrace the freedom of passionate love without the ties of marriage or obligations. Yet, he was mistaken. Vanessa was not Oksana. She was unfaithful and did not wait. Eventually, it all came crashing down. Whispers started circulating. Speculations that Oksana was seeing another man were all over the news. Yes, Peter Blomqvist, and not just any guy. A wealthy Swede who could provide her with a marriage proposal, a lavish lifestyle, and the stability she craved, things that Dalton would never do. Dalton refrained from arguing when the rumors turned out to be true. He refused to beg. He comprehended. This had been on his mind for quite some time. No woman will remain faithful to a man who doesn't value commitment. Subtly, he severed ties with the partner, retaining his dignity while bearing a scar that outstripped any performance he had ever given. Still, Dalton stood out because he never allowed his bitterness to influence his son. Dalton stayed a loving father even though most men would have cut off all contact with a woman who had betrayed them. Despite his strained relationship with Oksana, he never abandoned Alexander or his child's mother. He made sure he had everything he needed and spent quality time with Alexander. However, Oksana Grigorieva was far from finished. After a few years, she was involved in another public romance, this time with Mel Gibson, who was a major Hollywood star at the time. In contrast to her amicable split from Dalton, this romance became embroiled in a major scandal that rocked the entertainment industry. Gibson was unexpectedly accused of domestic violence by Oksana after she gave birth to their daughter Lucia in 2009, suing him for assault and seeking a restraining order. However, that was not the last of the problems. The subsequent release of leaked audio recordings shocked the general population. In addition to making blatantly racist comments, Gibson threatened to kill Oksana. Gibson was brought to justice after law enforcement became involved. He ended up with a 3-year probationary term, a counseling order, and community service requirements. The scandal almost doomed his career. After losing multi-million-dollar deals and the approval of many of his colleagues, Gibson fell from grace as a once great Hollywood star. In the midst of this mayhem, one peculiar fact persisted. No man had ever loved Oksana like Timothy Dalton, who never once grumbled about her. Unlike Mel Gibson, he refrained from openly criticizing her, fighting with her in court, or going on TV to condemn her. He quietly departed, maintaining his composure and fulfilling his role as a father. Upon reviewing the whole narrative, a single query remains. Dalton wondered if he had been betrayed or if he had just cast himself in the role of the abandoned man. A guy who was skeptical of commitment but still demanded allegiance. But there is an indisputable fact that stands regardless of the response. Timothy Dalton is now single after losing his 2 first loves. Maybe he had always planned on living that way. An iconic Hollywood tragedy, Timothy Dalton was a trailblazer who was forgotten all too soon due to his premature arrival. Audiences didn't warm up to him even though he returned James Bond to Ian Fleming's original concept. Fans were ecstatic when Daniel Craig's portrayal of James Bond, grittier, colder, and more grounded, came out 20 years later. The reality, though, is that Dalton had accomplished this feat in the 1980s. Just at that moment, audiences weren't prepared to hear him. Even some of Hollywood's brightest minds have admitted that this is unfair, so it's not just Dalton's fans who feel this way. Among the most lauded filmmakers of the modern era, Christopher Nolan publicly lauded Dalton as the most direct link to Fleming's novels. Nolan went so far as to say that he wanted to helm a Bond film in the vein of Dalton because he thought that was the most authentic portrayal of the character. Tragically, Dalton's story is about how innovation was misjudged. Someone may have said that License to Kill was a masterpiece if it had come out in the early 2000s rather than 1989. Unfortunately, Dalton took a back seat to Roger Moore's comedic interpretation of the character when it premiered. People started to look back and see that Timothy Dalton wasn't a failure after Daniel Craig's success. All he had done was be innovative for his time. However, Dalton's impact extended beyond Bond. He refused to let himself be consumed by Hollywood's indifference. Dalton maintained his impressive range of acting styles in the years that came after. By denying that he was only ever James Bond, he demonstrated that he was more than a one-hit wonder. In the gothic horror series Penny Dreadful, he made a lasting impression on television with an incredibly nuanced and complex performance. Neither the young Shakespearean actor nor the icy, math-savvy 007. With the breadth and depth of a legendary career, this actor brought it to the big screen. As the Chief, a shadowy and slightly evil figure in the DC universe, Dalton proved once again that he could elevate even the most out-there parts to iconic status in Doom Patrol. Being James Bond was unnecessary. It was unnecessary for him to be a famous actor. It was Dalton's talent alone that allowed him to dominate the screen. However, his most surprising contribution may have originated from an animated film. Few people noticed that Timothy Dalton was in the Oscar-nominated masterwork Toy Story 3 when it first came out and became a worldwide sensation. Despite the film's apparent departure from his usual fare, Dalton still managed to imprint his signature on one of the decade's most cherished films. Finally, what does Timothy Dalton's legacy actually consist of? An unremembered Bond? Hollywood has forsaken an actor? Alternatively, a forgotten icon whose worth is only now being appreciated for what it is? Maybe fame was never necessary for Dalton. He had never aspired to be Hollywood's ideal star. All he wanted was to be an actor and give his all to the craft. Maybe Hollywood will remember Timothy Dalton not as the forgotten Bond, but as the man who paved the way for all that came after him. Whether Dalton was successful was never an issue. Will anyone ever see that he was successful a long time ago? That is the real question. Although many of his contemporaries have married and settled down or found comfort in domestic life, Dalton remains single at the age of 79. As if his on-screen persona had dictated his actual destiny, he is the sole James Bond to have never been married or tied down to anyone. Contrary to popular belief, Dalton is not a lonesome mourner. It is his way of life, he says. Not a single scandal, social media post, or appearance at a glitzy event. As he moves at his own pace in the midst of the industry's mayhem, always maintaining a measured distance from the limelight, he finds joy in simpler yet profoundly personal pleasures, such as fishing in the Pacific, listening to jazz, and collecting rare antiques, rather than in Hollywood's extravagant parties. Even though Dalton has avoided the ostentatious lifestyle of Hollywood, he and Oksana Grigorieva's only son, Alexander, have a close relationship. Alexander has reached adulthood and is now a resident of the United States. He and his father are very close. They keep in touch regularly and visit whenever they can. Alexander is 28 years old. Although Dalton is not married, he has always been a steadfast father to Alexander, who is the most important thing in his life. Even more astonishing is the fact that Dalton has managed to keep things amicable with Oksana Grigorieva, despite their tumultuous history. Nothing like the public feuds that erupted between Mel Gibson and Oksana exists here. Even Dalton publicly backed Oksana when she got involved in her legal dispute with Gibson, saying that they had put the past in the past and that what was most important was their son's future. Dalton has always stood out from other Hollywood leading men because of his ability to maintain composure and dignity in the face of scandal and animosity, which can tear relationships apart. Dalton isn't often seen in public, but you might catch a glimpse of him cheering on Manchester City at their stadium. Even though he is no longer James Bond on screen, he exudes the air of an English gentleman and lives his life according to his own terms, never looking for approval from others. Maybe this is the ideal representation of Timothy Dalton, a loner who defies convention but never lets himself be consumed by isolation. Even though he was forgotten by Hollywood, he was never dependent on them to determine his value. Timothy Dalton was the James Bond that no one was prepared for, but who would go on to receive accolades and recognition in due time. Among Bonds, he might not have been the most financially successful. He was, however, undeniably, a memorable one. An ill-received trailblazer. A man whose principles never change. Never one to conform to social norms or seek fame, he always goes his own way. He walked away from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood and marriage, but he never stopped being himself. Dalton stayed true to himself in a world where everything is always changing. A gentleman, icy and dignified. A genuine Lone Ranger. Maybe Timothy Dalton would not have remained a mere relic but rather the finest Bond of all time if the people who saw the film in its original theatrical release had seen more. Even if Hollywood forgets about Dalton, Bond aficionados will always remember that he was instrumental in setting the stage for the rest of the franchise. Timothy Dalton, what are your thoughts on him? Were we misled into thinking he was the perfect Bond? Leave your opinions in the space provided. To ensure you don't miss any more captivating stories, please subscribe and give it a like. Perhaps after revisiting License to Kill and The Living Daylights, you will come to understand that Timothy Dalton was never a forgotten Bond, just one whose greatness we were slow to acknowledge.